On the afternoon of January 26, 1996, in the driveway of a farmhouse on an 800-acre estate outside Philadelphia, a 57-year-old heir to one of America's greatest fortunes raises a .44 caliber revolver and fires 3 shots into the chest of an Olympic gold medalist. The shooter is John Eleuthère du Pont. His net worth is estimated at $200 million. His victim is Dave Schultz, a wrestler who lived on the estate with his wife and children, training for the 1996 Olympics. Schultz's wife Nancy watches from the doorway as her husband bleeds to death in the snow. DuPont drives back to his mansion, barricades himself inside, and waits for police with an arsenal of weapons. It takes a 2-day standoff before he surrenders. But the murder of Dave Schultz was not an isolated act of madness. It was the culmination of 2 centuries of power, our privilege, and a family curse that seemed to grow worse with each generation. The DuPonts had been America's most powerful dynasty for nearly 200 years. They made the gunpowder that won the War of 1812. They supplied the explosives that built the Transcontinental Railroad. They manufactured 40% of all ammunition used by the Allies in World War I. By the 1940s, they controlled General Motors, owned the largest chemical company on Earth, and had produced more millionaires than any family in American history. But something was wrong inside the bloodline. The DuPonts had intermarried so extensively, cousins with cousins for generation after generation, that by the 20th century the family tree looked less like branches and more like a tangle of vines strangling itself. John DuPont, the man who murdered Dave Schultz, was not an aberration. He was a product. His great-grandfather had married his first cousin. His grandfather had married his first cousin. His parents were themselves related by blood. By the time John was born in 1938, he carried the accumulated weight of 136 years of genetic isolation. And John was not the only DuPont of his generation to make headlines for the worst possible reasons. Robert H. Richards IV, great-great-grandson of the Dynasty's founder, pleaded guilty in 2009 to raping his 3-year-old daughter. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison. Then she suspended the sentence entirely, ruling that Richards would not fare well in prison. A billionaire heir who admitted to sexually assaulting a toddler walked free. The case remained hidden from public view for 5 years until his ex-wife's lawsuit exposed the court records. This is the story of the DuPont bloodline, how America's first industrial dynasty built an empire on explosives, how they tried to keep their fortune in the family through generations of cousin marriage, and how the children born from those unions inherited not just billions, but madness, depravity, and a darkness that money could not cure. Subscribe if you want more stories of dynasty bloodlines and the fates of those born into too much power. The DuPont dynasty began with a man running for his life. Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours was a French economist and minor nobleman who had the misfortune of being successful under the wrong king. When the French Revolution turned bloody, Pierre found himself on the wrong side of history. A mob attacked his home in Paris. He defended it with a musket and a sword, killing 2 attackers. He was arrested, imprisoned, and scheduled for the guillotine. The blade fell before his turn came, but it fell on Robespierre instead. The terror ended. Pierre was released, but France was no longer safe for a man with aristocratic pretensions and a talent for making enemies. In 1799, Pierre gathered his family and sailed for America. His son, Eleuthère Irénée Dupont, had learned something useful in France. He had studied under Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, and he had worked at the French Royal Gunpowder Works at Essonne. When the DuPonts arrived in America, Eleuthère noticed something immediately. American gunpowder was terrible, inconsistent, weak, and dangerous, but he could make it better. In 1802, with financing from French investors, Eleuthère built a gunpowder mill on the banks of the Brandywine Creek in Delaware. He called the company A.E. Dupont de Nemours and Company. The location was perfect. The Brandywine provided water power for the mills. Wilmington provided access to shipping, and the young American Republic, constantly fighting someone, provided endless demand for explosives. The business grew steadily, then explosively. The War of 1812 created massive demand for American-made gunpowder. The DuPonts supplied it. When the war ended, Western expansion kept the orders coming. Every mine that blasted through rock, every railroad that cut through mountains, every quarry that carved out stone needed DuPont powder to do it. but gunpowder manufacturing was extraordinarily dangerous. The mills along the Brandywine exploded regularly. In 1818, an explosion killed 40 workers. In 1847, another blast killed 18. The DuPonts rebuilt each time, accepting the deaths as the cost of business. They did make one accommodation to the danger. The family built their mansions close to the mills, within the blast radius, so the workers would know the owners shared their risk. It was a gesture of solidarity, or perhaps of fatalism. Eleuthère died in 1834, having built a small fortune. His sons and grandsons built an empire. By the Civil War, the DuPonts were supplying gunpowder to the Union Army on a scale no other manufacturer could match. They produced nearly half of all the powder used by Union forces. The war made them rich. Reconstruction made them richer. And then came the consolidation that would make them dominant. In 1872, the DuPonts organized the Gunpowder Trade Association, a cartel that fixed prices, divided markets, and crushed competition. For 30 years, if you wanted to buy gunpowder in America, you bought it at the price the DuPont set. The Sherman Antitrust Act was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of monopoly. The DuPonts ignored it until 1907, when the federal government finally sued to break up the cartel. But by then, the DuPonts had diversified. They had moved from gunpowder into dynamite, from dynamite into smokeless powder, from smokeless powder into chemistry itself. They bought patents, acquired competitors, and hired the best scientists money could attract. When World War I began in 1914, the DuPonts were ready. The numbers are staggering. Before the war, the company employed 5,300 workers. By 1918, it employed 85,000. The DuPonts built 98 new plants to meet Allied demand for explosives. They manufactured 1.5 billion pounds of military explosives, 40% of the ammunition used by Allied forces on the Western Front. Every bullet fired at the Somme, every shell that fell at Verdun, nearly half of it came from DuPont factories. The profits were equally staggering. The company's net worth increased from $83 million in 1914 to $308 million in 1918. The family's personal fortune grew proportionally. By the 1920s, the DuPonts were not merely wealthy. They were among the 5 richest families in America, rivaling the Rockefellers, the Mellons, and the Carnegies. And they intended to keep it that way. The DuPonts had learned from European aristocracy that the surest way to preserve a fortune was to marry within the family. But if daughters married outsiders, dowries would drain away the wealth. If sons married heiresses from other families, control might slip from DuPont hands. The solution was simple. DuPont should marry DuPonts. The practice began with Eleuthère's children and continued for generations. First cousins married first cousins. When first cousins were unavailable, second cousins would do. The family tree became so intertwined that by the late 1800s, genealogists struggled to chart it. One member of the family reportedly needed a diagram to remember how he was related to his own wife. The consequences of this genetic isolation accumulated slowly, then accelerated. Early generations showed the expected problems. Infant mortality was high. Some children were born with disabilities that were quietly institutionalized and never discussed. But the family was large enough, and the infusions of outside blood just frequent enough, that catastrophe was avoided. By the 20th century, the odds had shifted. The DuPonts who emerged from this genetic bottleneck included brilliant industrialists and generous philanthropists, but they also included a rising number of members who struggled with mental illness, personality disorders, and behaviors that ranged from eccentric to criminal. William DuPont Jr., born in 1896, became obsessed with horse racing and eventually with a much younger woman named Jean Lister. He divorced his wife, married Jean, built her a 52-room mansion, and then watched helplessly as she divorced him and took him for millions. He spent his later years increasingly isolated, dying alone in 1965. Reynolds DuPont, born in 1908, Barrett was described by family members as emotionally unstable. He cycled through relationships, businesses, and episodes of behavior that concerned even a family accustomed to eccentricity. The specifics were kept quiet. The DuPonts had mastered the art of protecting their own, but no amount of money or influence could protect the family from John Eleuthère DuPont. John was born on November 22, 1938, the youngest child of William DuPont Jr. and Jean Lister. His parents divorced when he was 2 years old. His father essentially abandoned him. His mother kept him close, too close, in a relationship that observers would later describe as suffocating. Jean Dupont reportedly wanted a daughter. When she got a son instead, she dressed him in girls' clothing until he was old enough to resist. John grew up on Lester Hall Farm, a 400-acre estate that would later be renamed Foxcatcher Farm. He was educated at private schools, attended the University of Pennsylvania, and earned a Ph.D. in natural science from Villanova. On paper, he was accomplished. In person, something was clearly wrong. He had no social skills. He had no close friends. He had money, and money attracted people who pretended to be his friends until they got what they wanted and left. John cycled through hobbies obsessively, collecting birds, then seashells, then stamps, throwing money at each passion until he lost interest and moved on. In the 1980s, John discovered wrestling. He had tried the sport briefly at prep school and failed at it completely. Now, with unlimited funds, he decided to build a wrestling empire. He constructed a 14,000-square-foot training facility at Foxcatcher Farm. He recruited Olympic-level wrestlers by offering them housing, salaries, and access to world-class facilities. He named himself head coach of Team Foxcatcher, despite having no meaningful wrestling experience. For a few years it worked. Foxcatcher produced Olympic-caliber athletes. John Dupont basked in reflected glory, posing for photographs with champions, pretending he was one of them. He donated millions to USA Wrestling and demanded to be treated as a peer by athletes who could have broken him in half. But John's mental state was deteriorating. He believed the estate was under surveillance by foreign governments. He claimed to see ghosts, including the ghost of his mother, who had died in 1988. He told people he was the Dalai Lama of the Western Hemisphere. He installed machine guns on his property and drove around the estate in an armored personnel carrier he had somehow acquired. The wrestlers noticed. Dave Schultz, the Olympic gold medalist who had become John's closest companion at Foxcatcher, tried to manage his patron's episodes. When John ranted about conspiracies, Dave talked him down. When John's paranoia spiked, Dave stayed close to keep him calm. It was a dangerous arrangement, and Dave's wife Nancy begged him to leave. On January 26, 1996, John Dupont drove his Lincoln Town car to the farmhouse where Dave Schultz lived with his family. Dave was working on his car radio in the driveway. John called his name. Dave walked over to the car. John raised his revolver and fired. Dave's wife Nancy heard the shots and ran outside. She watched as John fired 2 more rounds into her husband's body, then drove away. Dave Schultz bled to death in his driveway. He was 36 years old. He left behind a wife, a son, and a daughter. John barricaded himself in his mansion. Police surrounded the property. The standoff lasted 48 hours. John was finally captured when police shut off his heat in January, and he came outside to fix the boiler. At trial, John Dupont's lawyers argued that he was insane, that paranoid schizophrenia had destroyed his ability to distinguish right from wrong. The jury disagreed with the full insanity defense but acknowledged his mental illness. They found him guilty but mentally ill of third-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 13 to 30 years in prison. John Dupont died at State Correctional Institution Laurel Highlands on December 9, 2010. He was 72 years old. He had spent his final years in a psychiatric facility attached to the prison, medicated into a semblance of calm, stripped of the fortune and the wrestling empire and the delusions of grandeur that had defined his life. The Schultz family sued the Dupont estate and settled for an undisclosed sum. Nancy Schultz became an advocate for victims of violence. The 2014 film Foxcatcher told a version of the story, with Steve Carell playing John Dupont in a performance that earned him an Oscar nomination. But while John Dupont's crime was public and dramatic, another Dupont heir committed acts that were arguably worse and nearly got away with it. Robert H. Richards IV was born in 1966, the great-great-grandson of Irénée Dupont, who had himself been a son of the Dynasty's founder. Robert grew up wealthy, or educated at expensive schools, insulated from consequences his entire life. He married a woman named Tracy, and together they had 2 children, a daughter and a son. In 2007, Tracy Richards filed for divorce. In the proceedings, she made an accusation that should have ended Robert Richards' freedom forever. She claimed that Robert had sexually abused their daughter, beginning when the child was 3 years old. The abuse had continued for 2 years. Robert was arrested and charged with 2 counts of second-degree rape of a child. In Delaware, second-degree rape carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in prison. Robert faced a potential 20 years behind bars, but Robert Richards never went to prison. In 2009, he pleaded guilty to 4th-degree rape, a lesser charge. The Superior Court Judge Jan Jordan sentenced him to 8 years in prison, then immediately suspended the sentence. Her reasoning, preserved in court documents, was that Robert Richards would not fare well in prison. A billionaire heir who had pleaded guilty to raping his own 3-year-old daughter was sentenced to probation, treatment, and registration as a sex offender. He walked out of the courtroom a free man. The case remained hidden from public attention for 5 years. Delaware courts do not automatically publish records, and no one was looking. Then in 2014, Tracy Richards filed a lawsuit against her ex-husband, alleging that he had also abused their son. The lawsuit exposed the earlier case. Journalists discovered the court records. The public learned that a DuPont heir had confessed to child rape and served no time, or the outcry was immediate and intense. Judge Jordan was criticized from every direction. Delaware law was scrutinized. Prosecutors defended the plea deal, arguing that the case was harder to prove than it appeared and that a trial might have resulted in acquittal. Victims' advocates were unconvinced. Robert Richards remains a registered sex offender. He has never been incarcerated for his crimes. The lawsuit filed by Tracy Richards was eventually settled for undisclosed terms. His children, the victims of his abuse, have grown up outside the public eye, protected from the attention their father's crimes attracted. The Richards case crystallized something the DuPont family had always known and outsiders had always suspected. Money could buy more than luxury. It could buy different rules. A poor man who raped his toddler would have gone to prison for decades. A DuPont heir went home. The DuPont Dynasty today is not what it once was. The company that bore their name merged with the Dow Chemical in 2017 and then split into 3 separate entities. No DuPont sits in the executive suite. The family's shareholdings, once controlling interest, have been diluted over generations into fragments spread across hundreds of descendants. But the wealth persists. Forbes estimates that the extended DuPont family still controls assets worth approximately $14.3 billion, making them the 13th richest family in America. They own estates in Delaware, horse farms in Virginia, properties scattered across the East Coast. They have endowed museums, funded universities, and built the Hagley Library, which preserves the family's archives for scholars who want to study America's first great industrial dynasty. There are estimated to be over 3,500 living descendants of Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, the French refugee who arrived in America in 1800 with nothing but his family and his son's knowledge of explosives. Some are still wealthy, most are not. The fortune has been divided and subdivided so many times that the average DuPont descendant lives a life closer to upper middle class than aristocracy. The cousin marriages have stopped. The genetic isolation that produced John DuPont and may have contributed to the dysfunction of other family members ended as the family grew too large to maintain. Modern DuPonts marry whom they choose, live where they want, and pursue careers unconnected to the chemical empire their ancestors built. Foxcatcher Farm was sold after John DuPont's death. The wrestling facility was demolished. The estate that once trained Olympic champions is now a development of luxury homes. The mansion where John barricaded himself during the standoff still stands, purchased by a developer who planned to restore it. Whether anyone will ever live there remains unclear. The DuPonts were never royalty. They held no titles, claimed no thrones, received no divine sanction to rule. They were simply a family that made something the world wanted, gunpowder, and made it better than anyone else. That was enough to build a dynasty that lasted 2 centuries, produced countless millionaires, and shaped American industry in ways that persist to this day. But dynasties exact a price. The DuPonts paid it in infant mortality and mental illness, in scandals suppressed and crimes unpunished, in children who inherited fortunes they could not handle and darkness they could not escape. John DuPont died in a prison psychiatric ward, a murderer. Robert Richards walks free, a confessed child rapist protected by his family name, And somewhere in Delaware, the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of Eleuthère Irénée Dupont are growing up, inheriting whatever legacy remains. The gunpowder mills along the Brandywine are museums now. Tourists walk where workers once died in explosions. The DuPont Company logo appears on products around the world, from Teflon to Kevlar to the chemicals that make modern life possible. The family that built it all has scattered into thousands of descendants, most of them unknown, and a few of them infamous. The DuPonts did not fall the way the Romanovs fell, executed in a basement. They did not lose everything the way the Habsburgs lost everything, exiled and impoverished. They simply diluted, generation by generation, until the concentrated wealth and concentrated power and concentrated dysfunction spread too thin to sustain a dynasty. What remains is money, memory, and the occasional reminder that the blood of America's most dangerous family still flows in veins across the country. Not every American dynasty stayed in America. The Vanderbilts built the greatest private fortune of the 19th century, then watched their descendants spend it into oblivion within 3 generations. If you want to know how a family worth more than the U.S. Treasury went broke, watch our video on what happened to the Vanderbilt bloodline.